Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Dev Parkour. I'm Brian Parks, and in this video, I want to talk about something that doesn't necessarily come into play with scaling an app, maybe for internal use. But if you're trying to turn your application into, say, a business, a scalable SaaS business, this is something that sooner or later you're going to come across. And the question is, do we want to do multi-tenant, true multi-tenant? Do we want to be single tenant, or do we want to have some hybrid mix of the two? Before we dive into why you might want to choose one over the other, let me describe what I mean by each of these. So when I talk about true multi-tenant, what I mean is you have one application or one system that everybody uses. Doesn't matter if they're a consumer, doesn't matter if they're maybe a corporation, it's all the same thing. Good examples of this are things like Netflix. We all go to netflix.com to log in. They are true multi-tenant. And that's kind of weird because that's primarily a consumer thing. I don't think they have a corporate side to it. Another example would be something like Asana. As far as I know, everybody just goes to asana.com to log in, regardless of whether you have a free account like I do or a corporate account. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, you have single tenant. And what I mean when I talk about single tenant is basically there's one copy of the piece of software, but whenever you spin up a new customer, they get a brand new instance, a new machine, a new container, whatever your infrastructure is. It doesn't really matter. It's just that when they sign up, they get a new stack, whatever that looks like, running the application. And some examples of that are things like Slack. Actually, that's a bad example. We'll get to that when we get to hybrid. I'm actually having trouble thinking of specific examples because a lot of times the way you interact with the single tenant model or the hybrid tenant model, it looks approximately the same. Either way, you probably go to something like your company name dot the service, right? So in the case of Jira, you have like your company name .atlassian.net. In the case of Slack, it's your company name .slack.com, I think it is. And aside from that, you can tell you get your own domain, you get your own URL, but beyond that, you can't really tell if it's just a facade over it could even be a true multi-tenant thing, right? You could do the multi-domain hosting sort of model, and all it's doing under the covers is figuring out what domain you use to access it, and then saying, oh, okay, now I know to use these resources and exclude those other resources. With hybrid tenant model, you might have some pieces that are single tenant, like front ends might be single tenant, to make it easier to create those custom domain names, or to even do more customization. If you want customers to be able to bring their own domains, then you might have the front end be single tenant, and then much of the back end, let's say you're using, some big data platform, like any of the AWS services, right? You might not necessarily want to have all of those separated out into individual accounts. That might be a lot of maintenance. That might be a lot of headache. And as long as you can segregate the data, which we'll get to in a minute, that's the big key here, is that separation of data between customers. As long as you can do that, there's no real downside to having multi-tenant pieces. Another case would be if you're doing feature flags. That's actually a very common one. So you might have primarily single-tenant infrastructure, but you do have some centralized feature flagging service, even if it's a third-party service. There have been a few startups that have sprung up over the last few years that specifically do that. So even if you're using a service for that, that's essentially, you might be single tenant on their infrastructure, but your customers are multi-tenant as far as your infrastructure is concerned for that piece, right? So you're in a hybrid tenancy sort of model. Now, going back to the big thing, this is probably the biggest reason to choose any one of these models over any other model, is that separation of customer data. So if you are in a very highly regulated space, you're probably going to go exclusively single tenant, because there's really no better way to guarantee that customer A's data stays in customer A's systems, customer B's data stays in customer B's systems, and they never go across. That also enables things like on-premises. So in a lot of highly regulated industries, they don't even want to buy something in SaaS. You might want to build a SaaS company, but in order to support some of those customers, you might also provide the option of running your software on premises. And obviously you can bump up the licensing, bump up the cost, change how support and service works, that sort of thing. But if you're going to go that direction, you really can't really even do the hybrid tenancy model, because anything that's multi-tenant is immediately, out of bounds. No can do. However, something like a true multi-tenancy model might make it really easy if you want to have interaction between people. Like Facebook, for instance, this is kind of an extreme example, but Facebook just simply wouldn't work unless it used a multi-tenant model, right? You need to be able to share with your friends. You need to be able to link with the people that you've connected with. Same thing with any of those social platforms. But if there's truly separation between instances, and more importantly, if you can clearly delineate where those instances begin and end. So with Slack, it's very clear where one workspace ends and another one begins, right? Different companies have different workspaces. Different organizations have different workspaces. There's no cross workspace sharing. I think that's actually wrong. I think there is a way to do that, but that was a recent addition, and there's additional infrastructure to support that. I think Slack has actually gone a hybrid tenant route. So they started out being fairly single tenant. They might have had multiple databases on the same machine, so in that sense they were multi-tenant. But each company had its own independent stack. And there was actually a router. You can find YouTube videos on the Slack infrastructure and how it's evolved over the years. But they had routing so that you went to mycompany.slack.com. It pointed you over here. You went to some other company.slack.com. You went over here and had that stack. But they all had they had a pool of machines that they were running. So they're on the hybrid tenant model. And the way they accomplish that separation of customer data is by having the customer data that needs to be separate, like messages and stuff like that, that is in more or less single tenant instances. Whereas some of the other like control stuff, like what server does customer A's data live on, that's in some sort of multi-tenant infrastructure. So that they, it's basically metadata about their overall system. So that's not an issue. You don't have to worry about mixing that between customers. So those are the big things. So you've got single tenant, you've got multi-tenant, and then you've got this kind of hybrid tenant sort of model. The biggest reason you might choose one over the others is customer data and how you need to protect it, what you need to do with it, and potentially how individual tenants might need to interact with each other. So hope you liked this video. Go ahead and give it a thumbs up if you did. Be sure to comment down below and feel free to add ideas to what I've said. Maybe you're using one of those models and and you chose it for a reason different from what I've mentioned here. If you like what I'm talking about on this channel, please be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell. Most of what I'm talking about these days has to do with Glassminnow, the legacy app that I've been working on. This was kind of a slight deviation, but it actually will come back up probably in a couple months. This is something that I've been thinking about as I've been planning where I eventually want to take this project. So we'll see which model I choose, whether I choose multi-tenant, single-tenant, or hybrid tenant. But I'm going to keep you in suspense. You'll just have to wait and see, again, for a couple months. Be sure to stay tuned for future updates as pertains to Glassminnow, and I will see you tomorrow.